Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Practice Group, and it's a place for thoughtful conversations on environmental and natural resources law and policy, ranging from the latest developments to perennial topics like litigation, enforcement, and compliance assurance. We're glad you're spending some time with us today. If you're listening on our website, or if you found a link to our show in the trade press, consider subscribing to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like to get your podcasts. If you like what you hear on the show, and I hope you do, leave us a review. Just remember that if you can't say anything nice, it's best not to say anything at all. The holiday season and New Year's always has me feeling even more grateful than I usually do. So I do want to note how appreciative we are in the Environment, Lands, and Resources group for the audience that's formed around this podcast. We're starting our third year of recording, and we're excited for what's to come. And speaking of kicking off our third year of podcasting, I think we have an excellent guest to help us do that. I'm excited to be joined today by Environmental Law Monitor listener, Erin Chancellor, who also happens to be the interim executive director of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Thank you for coming on the program, Erin. It's an honor to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really excited to be on the pod. So thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exciting to come across listeners in the wild. And I'm sure it's been an exciting couple of months for you as you have rolled into your new position at TCEQ. Can you tell us a little bit about what that transition has been like for you? I know that you've been at EPA Region 6 before, and you've had a stint at TCEQ before. What's new about the new role for you?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I will say I'm thankful that the transition happened, mid-December, right before the holidays, when generally the work is a little slower. So it's nice kind of dip my toe in on a holiday, except for there was the whole potential winter weather emergency. So, always going to keep things exciting. But I was pretty busy in legal, but it really pales in comparison to the executive office. I think it was really helpful coming from legal, just because the Office of Legal Services pretty much has a hand in every issue that comes up at the agency. So from a subject matter perspective, I'm familiar with most of the issues. And so that's made the transition a little easier. But it really, I think the biggest and oddest, and I guess maybe most surprising change has been, and this may be obvious to some other people, but I was surprised by the need to kind of recalibrate your mindset from a more of an advisory posture to really a decision-making position. And so it is just an odd thing that I haven't had to do before, coming from, a bunch of roles my entire career have really been, either support offices or just policy advising. And so that's been an interesting and surprising part of the transition for me.
You spoke a little bit about your prior experience. One of the things that's always interesting to me is what differences there might be working for the state government than working for the federal government at Region 6. And what are some of the standout differences to you?
Yes, so there are a lot. I'll tell you, I started my legal career in state government, and I'm definitely really a fan of state government. I've enjoyed my time working for the state, and I was a little hesitant to go to the federal government only because my experience had just I hadn't really experienced a lot of cooperative federalism. If I know that term got overused a little bit, but it just a lot of times felt like TCEQ didn't necessarily have a seat at the table in some other administrations. And then the last EPA administration, all the regional administrators had state experience, and a lot of who they were hiring at headquarters had state environmental government experience. And so I found that really reassuring. And that was part of why I was open to go into the federal government. But yeah, as far as differences, besides the obvious one would be the pay is very different. It just turns out the federal government has more money. But
an income tax is helpful with that.
Yeah.
That's not a suggestion for any state reps or senators that may be listening.
Yeah, agreed. But yeah, so it's a weird thing to kind of describe, but the volatility of policy at the federal level is just, especially coming from a state like Texas, is very, very different. And so, using Texas as an example, one political party has been pretty dominant for a little bit. And so for a state like Texas and an agency in the state that has governor appointees, the policy direction may change some, but it's pretty unlikely that there's going to be like a very rapid push for huge sweeping policy change across the entire agency.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, as you can imagine, it's not like that at the federal level. When the president's party changes, so do most of the policy objectives. And so
I feel like I've been writing about changes to the definition of waters of the United States.
That is my example.
Okay. Yeah.
Always.
Every 6 months, it's like we've got to do a new client alert on what the new changes or what this judicial decision did to whether that pond on your property is a wetland or, jurisdictional or not. And so that's been one area. And I know that for people who have practices in other areas, they're seeing the same thing and a lot of other agencies. So those shifts are real. They happen. I feel like I've got whiplash. I need one of those neck braces.
Oh, 100%. And that was something that before working for the federal government hadn't really occurred to me that, there's some EPA, lifelong career employees that helped craft that definition in the Obama administration. Then they repealed it and they replaced it in the Trump administration. And then that navigable water NWPR, navigable water protection rule, it was vacated and remanded. So then they went back to the older definition. They just wrote this new definition. And so it just seems like it could. And so that wasn't my experience as an appointee, but just kind of always made me feel for the careers a little bit. You could spend just years working on something that you just have to completely unravel. And so I think it's probably a pretty hard job if you're anything but just a real true apolitical federal government bureaucrat. I think it's probably pretty hard on people. So yeah, that swinging policy pendulum is a pretty big difference.
But that does have sorry to use this pun, but it does have downstream effects on state agencies too that have delegation, right? So and maybe you've seen this a little bit in your time at TCEQ, how does a state agency metabolize those federal changes that impact state programs? Is that a significant burden on the agencies when those occur?
It's definitely, it's definitely hard. It definitely can be a burden. Also, there's so much of it. It just, even though there's a new definition, there's probably going to be more litigation. The Sackett litigation's ongoing.
Absolutely.
So we don't even know what's going to end up sticking. And it's not just a lack of certainty for the regulated community and for the public, but it really is for state agencies as well. If we're supposed to be incorporating these rulemakings into or rulemakings, whichever it is, into ours, it's difficult when you don't know when final is actually final. That's
right.
So yeah, it's hard. It's hard on us as well. But I will say from an attorney perspective, it does keep it interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So I was thinking a little bit about what you may have been dealing with and your new role and what might be on your plate right now. And I thought we could talk a little bit about the sunset review process, which I think some of our listeners, maybe if you're in Texas and you're familiar with how state government works, you may have heard of sunset review before. But if you are not in Texas, you may not be familiar with it. So could you describe for those listeners what the sunset review process is?
Sure. So yeah, the agency is undergoing a sunset review during this current 88th legislative session. And so it's a 2-year process with a pretty significant public participation component. And I'll try to keep it short, but generally, the day after the 87th session ended, our TCEQ sunset team got to work. And the first thing we did was work on what ended up being a 684-page sunset self-evaluation report, which is called the SEER. So we finished that September 2021. And, it includes things like information on TCEQ programs, different funding sources, and also laid out 17 major issues that we identified as an agency. And
the sunset here is the sunset of the agency, right?
Yes.
You don't go through if the Sunset Review Commission is going to make a recommendation to the Texas legislature about whether the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality should continue to have the role it currently has. Should its functions be assigned to another agency? Should everything go to the Railroad Commission? Who knows? We're going to have to review this and see how the agency is doing. Is that a decent summary of how this process has worked?
Yeah, that's for sure. And so it's every 12 years. Well, it's scheduled every 12 years for every agency, but it can happen sooner if the legislature decides you should be up a little sooner. So ours will have been 12 years by the end of this session. So we just stayed on the normal track this time.
Okay. And so I looked a little bit at the Sunset Commission staff's report, where they take public comments, where they read the reports that TCEQ submitted, and then they highlight some potential suggestions for the commission to deliver to the legislature as part of that process. And so I think we're in the middle of this process right now. The 88th legislative session has just kicked off, and I imagine you'll be going to a number of meetings. But in that review, I noticed a couple of things. I was curious if you would have any thoughts you could share on them. The Sunset Commission, not the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, but the Sunset team expressed concern that Texans may not fully understand, for the purposes of permitting, whether they qualify as an affected person so that they could then participate in the permitting process. Or they may struggle with TCEQ's website and finding information on that permit application. Obviously, these have not been made, adopted and made final by the legislature. But on transparency, the Sunset team has expressed a little bit of concern that Texans might not fully understand whether they qualify as an affected person for purposes of participating in permitting procedures for facilities. Or people may struggle with TCEQ's website and finding the permit application information relevant to a proposed facility or a proposed permitting amendment. Are we going to see a TCEQ website facelift? Are we going to see new procedures being rolled out to make sure that people understand whether they qualify as an affected person? I realize that none of this is final yet in terms of Sunset, but curious what your thoughts are on the transparency issue.
Sure. So, there are certain things that we can we can start working on. And there's some things that we would likely kind of wait until we see what the final version says. But as far as we had 4 exceptional items. Mm-hmm. And one of those was for the website, particularly to increase access to public records. And so, as you can imagine, it would be easier on us and the public if we had more of these records publicly accessible. Mm-hmm. But it costs money. Unfortunately, you can't just have an intern scan documents all day.
That's right.
So, it costs quite a bit of money to get all these records on the agency website, make sure they're accessible. A lot of them have to be redacted. There's laws about confidential information. They need to be redacted before they can be made public. So all that costs money. So one of our exceptional item requests was to increase access to public records, and the request was $7 million for the biennium. Another request was about agency website usability enhancements, and this is actually directly from the Sunset staff report to Major Issue 1, which really got into the detailed need for enhancements to the website to improve, both usability and ease of access. Mm-hmm. So that we asked for $6 million over the biennium, and also 9 FTEs to maintain and develop content and ensure cross-functionality of the website. With any tech request, you need money and you need people. And so we did make those were 2 of our 4 exceptional item requests. And as far as the working on transparency, the Sunset staff identified transparency and meaningful public input as areas that the agency needs improvement. So they did have some suggestions, and included statutory change to require public comment to remain open for at least 36 hours after a public meeting, that we post administratively complete permit applications and associated material on the website, things like that. And to a kind of a related one was the commission voting in a public meeting on these key foundational policy questions. And they also requested that we develop a guidance document explaining how the agency makes affected person determinations. And so we've started working on that. So those kind of recommendations are things that we'll start working on in the meantime. Mm-hmm. But yeah, then there's others that if it requires a statutory change, we'll probably wait to see what comes of the final bill before we wouldn't want to start a process that needs to be different based on what the legislature directs.
No sense in getting out ahead of yourself or getting out over your skis.
Yeah, but luckily some of the recommended management actions, those can be implemented while we're waiting for the sunset bill. So we'll go ahead and start working on some of those.
I also noticed that there was a recommendation from the Sunset Commission that TCEQ establish sort of a centralized committee for reviewing certain requests and compliance history, specifically affirmative defense requests for air emissions violations, which we've already talked a little bit about the possibility of a winter storm. There's always concern about winter storms and affirmative defense requests for emissions exceedances and so on and so forth. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in September, the agency actually created a centralized emissions events section to review emission events. And
Already
request
done.
for affirmative
Incredible.
defense. Yeah. So that's something, we could immediately get to work on. And, we did the whole compliance history rulemaking amendments, which was a pretty big deal. It was the first time it had been done in quite a while. But some of the direction from the Sunset staff was to regularly update compliance history ratings, consider all violations when classifying a repeat violator and reclassify record-keeping violations based on potential risk and requiring annual confirmation of operational status of entities with temporary or open-ended permits. So there were a few things that they recommended, and we'll see what ends up happening. But the things that we can implement now, we're trying to go ahead and get done.
Well, okay, so let's pivot a little bit from talking about Sunset just to speaking about session generally. So when it comes to session, which we've just kicked off, I know that we're expecting to see a lot of activity around the grid, a lot of activity around property taxes, and we have a huge budget surplus. And I know that everyone's going to want a slice of that pie. What are some things that you and your team are watching as we make our way towards Sine Die?
Sure. So there were two other exceptional item requests that we made, and our really big one is targeted salary increases for our mission critical staff. We made a $72 million biennium request. So this is really a big priority for us. The agency is facing a really big challenge to attract and retain a highly advanced educated workforce. This exceptional item request would allow us to bring the 35 classifications with the highest turnover and salary lag up to a competitive salary, while also providing the remainder of the staff an increase. And so part of the reason we need this is almost half of the employees at TCEQ have been with the agency less than 5 years. Staff resignations remain high. Staff with less than 4 years of tenure make up 61% of our resignations. And in many cases, our salaries just aren't competitive with other state agencies and local governments. Our salaries lag other state agencies by as much as 40%. When I was head of legal, I kept a running list of where attorneys went, like where we lost attorneys. And since 2016, like over 30 of the people who of the attorneys specifically who separated went to other state agencies. We've lost, lose a lot to, not a lot, but we lose a few to EPA, a few to local government, a city of Austin notoriously pays more.
So what you're saying is like, it's really sort of a lateral move problem.
Yes.
And
it is. A lot of people, they say money. We do an exit survey, and the majority of people say the reason is the money. And so, almost 80% of TCEQ salaries are below the midpoint in the salary range. And, we really want to be at the table and compete with other state agencies and local governments and offer competitive salaries. And especially when you're living somewhere like Austin with the rate, we have the high cost of living, and we don't do locality pay. So it's trying to just be able to have people, you go to law school and you become an attorney, we should be paying you a good salary that you can live on, and also be able to work for the state and have, really fulfill your desire to be a public servant and not have to worry about how you could pay rent and if you could ever buy a house. So a lot of my background is obviously I just know a lot about the attorneys. Sometimes I use that as an example, but it is something, a lot of our mission critical staff is in the same boat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have an advanced degree in law or you have an advanced degree in biology or anything else, there are a lot of opportunities for you. And if you want to fulfill some of what you believe are your personal callings, then it's great to do that at a place that can pay you commensurate with that. One other question, and thinking about the budget surplus and thinking about new initiatives, is there any effort at TCEQ or related agencies to make headway on long-term water supply issues that we're facing in the state? I know we're in the middle of the drought or another drought again. And so thinking desalination plants and permitting those, or storage capacity, establishing water infrastructure. Are there any initiatives that we're seeing at the state government or in the agencies on those questions?
As far as, kind of in terms of the budget surplus, I wouldn't say there's a specific TCEQ driven effort, but part of asking for that targeted salary increase also is so that if we can retain expertise across the agency and fill these, 400 plus vacancies, then we're better suited to serving our regulated community more expeditiously and really ensure the agency isn't holding up important long-term water supply issues. So I know it sounds like everything's coming back to our big exceptional item request, but as far as this session goes, it really does. It's critical for the agency to be fully fully staffed so that we can really focus on these big issues the state is having, like the drought.
So one of the things that we've been following at Bracewell, and our listeners will probably have seen this in client alerts and in blog posts and indeed in podcasts, we have really seen environmental justice become a prominent emphasis for the Biden administration and a major concern of a number of different kinds of stakeholders. And the regulated community is wondering how to do environmental justice well. And I know that the TCEQ has made recent efforts to improve engagement of low-income communities, of communities where we don't have primary English speakers. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of those initiatives that we've recently seen from TCEQ?
Sure. So there was a big alternative language rulemaking that the agency did with the pandemic, sometimes I forget how many years ago it was, but it was recent. Right. It started, yes. The original request was in 2019. And so a big part of that push was to make sure that we are providing, translation interpretation services when needed, and just making sure that, some of our documents are translated when they need to be. And part of that, it was kind of a twofold reasoning originally. Part of it was a petition for rulemaking. And then also there was a Title VI complaint about alternative language requirements. And so in the end, for that Title VI complaint, we held these two public meetings in the Houston area that were just open to the public. And we kind of had a little demonstration of some of our air monitoring equipment and did a presentation on the new language requirements, and also allowed the public to do a little Q&A with some agency staff. And so I think those meetings were really successful. Those were, I want to say overall, between the rulemaking and the Title VI informal resolution agreement requirements, we had to have somewhere from 10 plus public meetings to kind of let people know about all these different efforts. And so, from the agency's perspective, these meetings were really successful. I think the public really appreciated them. And it's always great for us to get feedback from the public to hear, what we're doing well and what we could be doing better. And so we also put together just kind of a Title VI compliance website that keeps all the agencies, basically all of our efforts are in that one place. So, those public meetings, the transcripts are there. I believe any of them that were recorded, the recordings are up there. The informal resolution agreement's up there in multiple languages. It kind of just goes in our new language access plan, our non-discrimination plan, and also our public participation plan. Those are all up on the website as well. And so we've really just tried. There's always going to be room for improvement, but we're really trying to make sure the public understands these processes and that they have access to the information they need to really actively participate in the permitting and regulatory process.
So with the new public participation rulemaking, with the Title VI resolution, has TCEQ seen any increase in public inquiries or public participation in permitting as a result of these changes, or do you think it's too early to tell?
The whole point really is just to be able to provide more tools and access for those folks to better understand the process. I don't know that I can say whether there's been an increase, but I would think, providing more access to the public and ensuring they understand those processes would result in an increase in public participation. But I think it's hard to definitively say. So
another question on the environmental justice front. At the very end of December of 2022, we saw a new guidance document from EPA addressing environmental justice in air permitting. And it outlined 8 different things that state agencies like the TCEQ and the members of the regulated community can do to begin addressing and understanding and applying concepts of environmental justice to the air permitting process. And one of the things the document calls for is increased discussion of environmental justice between state agencies that have a permitting function and EPA regions and headquarters. Where's TCEQ in digesting that document, and have EPA and TCEQ personnel discussed implementation of that document so far?
Yes, so I thought the cover letter with that document was interesting in that, it was from OAR and headquarters to the regions for discussion with the states. And so I think it even maybe specifically said something that's not necessarily a guidance. It's more of a guide. So I just thought that was an interesting way to present it coming from headquarters. But I've read it. My folks have looked at it. To my knowledge, no, we have it. specifically discussed it with the region or with headquarters at this point. They did present a really high level version of it to the Environmental Council of the states. But we'll see how they communicate with the states based on that guide. So I'm interested to see kind of what the intent is there. I mean, I know that we've seen the principles, but putting out that kind of document, I'm not really sure what they're looking to achieve with that.
Well, and that's one of the questions that we sometimes have from facility operators, people with air permits. And when it comes to permitting a new facility or having a permit amendment for modifications to an existing facility, I think companies are curious about what they can be doing sort of on the pre-application side to think about environmental justice and to try to do environmental justice the right way. Do you have any thoughts for them, any guidance for them that's actionable?
Yeah, sure. Well, from EPA's perspective, the thing that we keep hearing is engage often, engage early with the community. But from TCEQ's perspective, I would say it's probably a good idea for applicants to familiarize themselves with our TCEQ public notice requirements, which include a somewhat new addition, which is TCEQ's public involvement plan requirements. And we've been referring to those as a PIP. So if you've heard about PIPs, that's what that is. And they're really not intended to slow down the permitting process. It's really intended to be a tool that lets the public know at the beginning of the process if certain types of public outreach, which can include alternative language notices, are really going to be necessary to make sure that potentially affected communities are afforded equal opportunities to participate in that permitting process. The parameters for when a PIP is required are pretty specific. So it would only be required if it's a new permit application or new activity, and that new application or activity needs to require notice, and it needs to be considered to have significant public interest, and it needs to be in certain geographical locations, which does cover quite a bit of the state. It's urban metroplexes like Austin, DFW, Houston, San Antonio, also West Texas, the Panhandle, or the southern border. So if all four of those factors are applicable to your facility, then a PIP is going to be required. But all those forms are on the agency website, including translated forms. There's templates and implementation guidance. And so we're trying to help everyone out with that as much as we can. And the effective date for those was November 1st.
And so it should be pretty clear that the circumstances in which a PIP is required. And so the best thing to do is to familiarize yourself in advance with those requirements so you don't go ask TCEQ for a permit or submit your application and then you're caught flat-footed because you didn't know these requirements. So that's helpful.
Yeah, and that's something that really, your permit, whoever you're working with on the, your permit writer, whoever you're working with in the program office, they're there to help you with that too. And it really is intended to just be short, include all your outreach efforts in one place. And especially this is an opportunity that if you as a facility have decided to go above and beyond our public notice or our any regulatory or statutory requirements the agency has, put it in there. If you're doing extra things for the community, it's a public document. It's going to let everyone know what you're doing. And so I think that's a good opportunity for folks to be able to really highlight all the efforts they're making to involve the community in the process.
That's one of the things that we've talked about in a lot of our presentations as well, the importance of sort of telling your whole story and making sure that that is out there. One final question before we go. What might we be seeing in terms of developments from TCEQ in coming months? Say what's on your 2023 agenda that might affect the industrial sector specifically? Any priorities the commission has for 2023? What are its New Year's resolutions, I guess?
Well, I know you're asking about the commissions, but I think kind of the more interesting things are probably coming from EPA that'll eventually, affect TCEQ and the industrial sector in Texas. And some of them we've touched on, the WOTUS definition. We are still waiting for that to officially be published in the Federal Register.
That's
so
right.
I keep checking every day. Yeah, you and me both. But so eventually that, and then EPA in I want to say October 2022 went final with a couple of bump ups for ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NAAQS. Mm-hmm. And those are ultimately going to result in the state needing to plan for and implement some additional emissions controls and, make some SIP amendments. And so there, is the 2008 8-hour ozone NAAQS. The DFW and Houston areas got reclassified from serious non-attainment to severe non-attainment. And then for the 2015 8-hour ozone NAAQS, EPA reclassified DFW, Houston, San Antonio from marginal to moderate non-attainment. So those will be, that's a big deal for Texas. And then recently, I think you probably saw the proposed lower NACs for fine particulate matter. So I don't think that's been published yet either, but it is a pretty big change. But there's no telling when it'll go final. So we'll just have to see what happens there, because it's only at the proposal stage right now. But they propose some lower standards, but then also they're taking comment on a broader range of lower standards. So it'll be interesting to see what they go final with if they have such a broad proposal.
Fortunately, nothing related to indoor gas stoves and other gas appliances.
Yeah, so many gas stove memes.
That's right. It's really been quite a day or two on the internet. Well, thank you so much for spending a little time with us, Erin. It's great to meet you and spend some time thinking about what we could be seeing in 2023. I think it's going to be a pretty busy year for you and me both. And so it'll be interesting to see. But always great to have you. And maybe we'll have you back soon and to see how 2023 went.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to the whole Bracewell team for making it happen. I really appreciate it.
Of course. That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests, as well as Dorn, Julia, and Emily, and the rest of our production team who helped to make our podcast possible. And of course, you, our listeners. We'll talk to you soon.